home right now. I'm on vacation with my family. So my Wi-Fi, my setup, my room, everything is a little unfamiliar. If my audio or something is really, really bad, please let me know. But I hope it's okay. Um, yeah, I was just like excited. I see a lot of kind of familiar faces, some new faces. I see someone from a college sustainability group that I was a part of. I see people from startups that I have been involved with through my career. I see people that I've met through kind of this new journey of kind of these maybe fringe conversations that I've gotten interested in, like what I'm presenting on today. I'm not sure if they're in this room, but I swear in the big room I saw my high school physics teacher, and I really hope that he's coming to this, which is really cool. And I think I just want to be a little bit like cheesy for a moment and say, this is a little bit fringe from what I'm normally asked to speak on. This is something that is more close to my heart personally, but it's also something I want to intentionally bring more into my career. And you'll see why I think the whole point of this talk is that I think more of us should be talking about this and bringing this into our careers. But this is kind of a different talk for these kinds of spaces a little bit. I'm definitely a little bit nervous, even though I'm excited. And I want to really thank the Volta Foundation for inviting me to come speak on this particular topic. I really give them a lot of credit for giving space for these kinds of alternative discussions. I think that's really cool. And again, I think one of the main points of the talk I want to give today is just like normalizing these sorts of conversations and really starting to like brainstorm how we can use this kind of thinking and bring it into be it our day jobs or outside of our day jobs. And I'll talk a bit about what I've done and how I've done that. But thank you all for being here. So I'm going to get into it. I think I'm basically just going to give a talk. It's like 20 slides, but they're quick, a lot of them. And then hopefully we'll have time for discussion. I can certainly stay late if people are interested. So again, this is revisiting the plot in clean energy tech. I really hope this is not going to be disappointing because that's obviously a really big topic, and I could take that a lot of different ways. And I'm sure some of you maybe think I'm going to go one way or a different way. My personal background is in venture capital. At least my career as of today in the last 5 years, I've worked at a thematic clean energy focused venture capital firm with particular focus on hard tech, physical products being built by companies, mostly batteries, and that's why I've been so close to the Volta Foundation. Um, I am not representing that firm today. You'll see I'm kind of talking a lot about VC, maybe in not the most positive light, but again, I think I'll bring it back to why I think that doesn't matter what job I have, right? It gives me experience with which to say some of the things, but I don't think giving this kind of talk, having these conversations is incongruent with also working in venture capital or working in corporations, right? But just to give you a sense of like, I have a little bit of background with which to talk about this. I've been doing that for the last 4.5 years. Our firm has over 400 million assets under management, but we're very startup like. So I touch lots of aspects from portfolio support, technical diligence, corporate interfacing, et cetera. My background before that is technical. I have a PhD in chemical engineering. But overall, I'd say my career North Star has been to be in the climate space to make impact towards climate, this big existential issue. And so my kind of pitch for this talk, and I'd be curious just quickly if people feel inclined, no problem. If not, to like raise hands, just like however you want to do that through Zoom, you know, are you someone here that identifies like as working in climate and as someone that does that because, climate is really important to you? So it's definitely me. Doesn't have to be everyone, but because that's kind of just the impetus of this talk is I really like as an investor, most of the people I talk to, even if they are on the financial side, I do get the sense that most people identify as working in climate and feel driven to make impact in climate. And what I find interesting is that despite that, I think there is kind of a lack of conversation around the baseline plot. With one thing I also sometimes feel, and this is again not really a knock on anyone, I think sometimes we like forget maybe or like have we're so focused on our day jobs and what our kind of role in what again, I think we're in our day job because we're motivated by climate change, but we so quickly get sucked into the specifics of what we're doing. I'm definitely do that myself that I think we forget the bigger picture that like climate change is really happening. And I really don't mean this in a patronizing way at all. And I'm sure people are very aware, but just as like a quick, reminder, and it does come up in conversations where I'm not sure there's an understanding of the magnitude and urgency sometimes. I'm sure we've all started to see more local examples like hurricanes, droughts, wildfires, things like that, right? But the truth is also that the majority of what's going to happen in the near term and at the biggest scale is probably not going to be affecting most people in this Zoom call today. It's going to affect a lot of people in the global south. I met a really, really ambitious senior at college senior who was working on a project related to the island nation of Tuvalu, which is in kind of near Samoa. Their island country is literally going underwater in real time. Their president or prime minister, I'm not sure the term they use, shown in this picture on the left here, gave a really powerful speech in the water, kind of to demonstrate that they are flooding in real time and they are actually navigating how to make a digital twin of their entire land and culture just to preserve it with time, right? So these things are happening in real time right now. And, I think that's really the key is that this is a time sensitive, urgent issue. This is not something that we can continue to let play around with the market dynamics because we're going to have irreversible changes to people's lives and the physical planet as well. And again, I really don't mean this in a patronizing way. I'm sure everyone here knows this, but I think sometimes like I forget this. Like I think we are insulated from it in many ways, and that's kind of the motivation. So, getting into this again, I said like this could be a very broad topic. I work in venture capital. This is kind of the startup ecosystem talk. So, I'm going to try to ground this in venture capital startup and where that nest fits in the broader climate ecosystem. But part of my argument too, as well, like this is focused on that section of the value chain is, I think, a very, very important like linchpin of what we are betting our entire climate strategy on. And I'll talk a bit about why that is. Um, but again, I think sometimes people maybe could roll their eyes like, why do we spend so much time talking about VC and startups? It's really that's where so much of the climate tech innovation is being dependent on that space. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And there are a lot of fundamental qualities about clean energy technologies that make it very challenging for this to be a successful endeavor. They're first of a kind folk systems deployed in highly regulated markets, right? So that means there's long time scales needed to research, develop, commercialize, qualify, and deploy. They're often very, very big projects, meaning they're very capital intensive, right? Again, I'm sure people know this, but there are fundamental qualities that make climate tech a particularly challenging sector to get off the ground economically. And again, if you're doing so from kind of this startup venture angle, as we'll continue to get into. Um, so getting into why that is, right? I think like it's very clear that corporations have a short-term kind of mindset, and that has been increasingly the trend over the last, call it 50 years or so, right? I just think it was interesting that the 2025 Nobel Prize in Economics was around innovation-driven economic growth, right? Like there is this understanding in economics that long-term growth is dependent on innovations that take a long time to develop, right? And yet, ever since we have kind of move towards the maximizing shareholder value kind of perspective, we are much more on a quarterly time scale, right? Expecting returns on investment in very short timeframes. And I think this has really shifted the kind of dynamic where large corporations with large balance sheets, lots of expertise, historically more patient timeframes and self-incentivized patient timeframes have now kind of gone away. And that kind of has it's done a lot for the stock market and people but what has that really done in terms of the broader innovation landscape and the commercialization actual deployment of new technologies, right? I think the landscape has shifted. So a little bit of data related to that. Here you can see on the left the percent of cash flows returned to shareholders. as a function of time, right? So essentially, like, where is money in corporations going? A lot of it's going back to shareholders, dividends, things like that, right? Again, with this focus on kind of financial returns, the stock market being very, very important, increasingly important. Um, and that means less kind of internal R&D dollars, and instead, rather than taking the money and time to innovate internally, they are leaning more on the idea of acquiring companies, startups, et cetera, right? So let someone else take the long amount of time and money to develop a new technology. We'll just come in when it's ready, and we're not really allocating money in the same way we used to. And that has kind of also corresponded to this like boom of the venture capital industry. I think this is, I'm very much simplifying things. There are so many different angles with which we could talk about it. The fact that more money has been returned to shareholders, that the stock market has been propped up by this approach, has meant we've had a lot more wealth inequality. We've created a lot more wealthy individuals that have had assets with which to pursue more risky investments. That industry is being created by that, et cetera. But the point is that, in a different time, a lot of new innovation was primarily coming out of corporations in a way that it's not really happening today. And so startups are kind of a necessity for new technology development as we kind of progress forward in many aspects, but certainly I think in climate tech as well, which is also just kind of a new industry in and of itself, right? So this schematic actually comes from a paper from one of my colleagues. So shout out to James Frith. But this is essentially, kind of getting back to that slide I showed earlier where it's challenging to do clean energy and climate tech, physical product development, right? This is talking about batteries specifically. So we're at Volta, I'll use the battery example. And it's talking about kind of the amount of dollars it takes to get through the technology readiness scale. I've kind of superimposed really rough estimates of what I have anecdotal or seen through my job, as timelines for what these timescales take, right? And essentially the high level takeaway is, it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time. And what is venture capital if they are the primary mechanism that's funding these types of companies need to see? They are predicated on 10-year fund lifetimes with 30% IRRs, right? So capital intensive companies don't typically look great for the return on investment. Time intensive companies, same thing, right? So at the very least, you have to be able to justify an exit within 10 years, and 10 years is frankly generous, because you're often not investing on day one of that fund. And if you're needing to put in hundreds of millions of dollars, there's very few exit opportunities that are going to give you a proper return on that from a venture capital lens, right? So we just create this very, very high bar fundamentally, right, for what needs to be successful, for venture capitalists to fund it. And we call what we're in right now clean tech 2.0. I'd say a lot of that has been dominated by battery technology, right? Clean tech 1.0 was its own thing. That was a lot of the solar and wind and some of the energy efficiency stuff, right? Roughly, 2006 to 2011. Venture capital firms spent $25 billion funding clean energy technology in that time frame, and less than half of that capital was returned. Again, venture capital is definitely on a more than 1x return expectation, right? I think a fund, you want to see a 2 to 3x return. And this is basically just showing, I mean, you could argue this graph shows a lot about just venture capital as an industry and how maybe that value proposition is questionable. But I'm just trying to focus here more so on the clean tech aspect of it. Even relative to other industries, failed at a much, much higher rate. And again, this was primarily due to the physical product development subsection of clean tech, which is ultimately the types of technologies that are actually going to make a difference in climate tech. I'm not saying we don't need the software stuff, but if we don't have the physical hardware deployed, we're not going to abate any emissions. We're not going to change anything, right? And so, what I would like to get to is, this idea, like even the talk we just heard, and it's absolutely no knock on that talk. That was a really, really interesting conversation. And that kind of conversation is the role I play in my day job every single day. And so I agree with so much of what they said. But these conversations around repivoting and refocusing, and the bar is higher this year, and it has to have commercial proof points and this and that. I just what I'm going to try to get to by the end of this, and I promise I only have not too many more slides, is just I don't I don't think it's just that Trump did this and this thing happened. It's not these situational factors. I think there are quite inherent dynamics around climate tech, around the market that the way the economy is designed that are that was always fundamentally going to facilitate this solution in clean tech 1.0 and perhaps will for 2.0 as well. And so the consequences when expectations are not aligned with the needs, right? You also experience a lot of economic inefficiency, which I think, again, I'm not going to argue here today what sort of economic lens and viewpoint we should have for the world necessarily. But even if we do want to have a very market oriented view of the world, this kind of venture capital startup approach is also kind of inefficient, right? Like, for example, think about the silicon anode companies, right? I've just cited two of the biggest ones. We've invested multiple billions of dollars into multiple companies that, yes, there are differences in how Sila, Group 14, Nanograph 1D, make their technology. And I work in venture capital. I am in the business of digging into the details and discerning those differences. I'm definitely not trying to undermine that. But the value to society and climate is probably very similar at the end of the day for all four of them if we could make them work, right? And what have we done by diluting $4 or $5 billion across a number of bets when none of them have broad commercialization yet today? And what could have happened if we had put kind of a thrust behind one of those and made it a priority, right? That's just one small example. What I hate to see is, it was mentioned in the earlier talk, when a company dies, we've had hundreds of millions of dollars that have been put into that company that are now lost, right? And it's not a net zero, obviously, but what could that money have done had it been more concerted, coordinated, et cetera? The top example, the way we set up venture return needs, right? You need to kind of start with a beachhead, and then you need to end in this ginormous market like electric vehicles. Those markets are often incongruent in terms of what they need from a technical solution, right? So again, we're imposing a market oriented lens on the technology, and I'm not saying that the technology doesn't eventually need to be somewhat cost competitive, but at the same time, I think we're creating a lot of inefficiencies with the bar that we are putting with the venture capital model. Government, right, is where we always like hope is the backstop, right? And I don't think I need to belabor the point that that's not been working very well. The priorities constantly shift. I did think that comment was funny in the last talk that someone was joking about how the question was phrased as, governments think really long term. Obviously, in some cases they do, but I think often governments think in 4-year cycles at most. We've seen things reverse, flip, this and that, cause a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of loss of money. I get very frustrated that all of the kind of appreciable grants that my startups receive are often tied to 50-50 cost share, which means like if you still can't raise a very significant amount of venture capital money, and that risk appetite isn't there for that stage, the grant didn't really help you with anything, right? And I have multiple startups that have received significant grants from the government and cannot raise the cost share, and that money is just not going to end up being utilized. The government typically focus a lot on kind of the upfront money and not really the actual market dynamics that would make a product successful. And then, of course, there are other forms of capital. Another thing I found interesting in the last talk, like we talked a lot about, oh, well, there's CVC, there's impact investing. I will say the interrupting comment was, hitting at an important point around impact investing, right? While impact investing, could theoretically be some sort of gap from everything I've experienced, it often is very similarly structured to traditional financial venture capital in terms of its return and thresholds and risk appetite. Corporate venture capital, they're supposed to have a more strategic lens and less interested in the returns, but I have not seen that to be the case in many instances that I work with a lot of CVCs. I had a very interesting call with a CVC out of a big chemical producer in the battery space in Japan, and he was saying, if we do not prioritize the returns of our portfolio, we are going to be cut. We're going to be the first business unit cut out of this company. And so very similar to the dynamics that started, this industry, right? What I was talking about, loss of corporate innovation, refocusing towards these near-term shareholder returns, are the same reasons that corporate venture capital firms are not really all that different from a traditional venture capital firm and are very returns focused. And then project finance, is great if you can make it there, but most startups aren't in that category at all. And, again, if I think there's a lot to be said about should we really be competing with China? That's a whole different topic and debate I'm not going to open up today. But, I would say that the venture capital model is also failing our kind of geopolitical security goals. My firm has taken a very pro-China approach in terms of having our startups work with and sell into China and kind of take business out of the US to China because the Western OEMs, because of all the things I've already talked about corporations, are not really seeking innovation. They are not really willing to take bets on new technology development, it seems like. I have so many startups that have been engaged with the right corporates for 4 or 5 years, and they're still not willing to purchase a product yet, right? It's just too risky, it seems to them, and they can't justify the spend. So we go to China, who actually is willing to do things at a more rapid time scale, who's willing to put money behind things, right? And so I don't think this is facilitating really any of our goals in many sorts of ways. This model that we're operating under is my point. So I'm worried we are doomed to repeat clean tech 1.0, right? I mean, there's lots of sign. I mean, we're all talking about the decrease in funding, right? It feels like we are, getting to a different point. The failures are similar reasons as 1.0, right? Competitive loss to China, changing US policy and priorities, and reduced government support. Um, and this is what I think, like, one of my favorite slides is like, I see so many articles and podcasts and LinkedIn posts that are basically just saying like, well, we're in a new era of clean tech where, the bar is high and, things have to be commercially scaled and you have to have revenue and this and that. And then there's also kind of the commentary that we're just repivoting and we're moving towards AI and we're moving towards defense, right? Um, I mean, I think all of that's true if you're still going to stay within the same mind frame, right? But I think the only thing that that's going to facilitate is going to be the demise of clean tech 2.0. I think it may survive in the sense that AI will continue, but I would argue largely AI is not a climate tech industry. I think it creates some opportunities for some climate tech, but I don't think it is fundamentally, by definition, going to support climate needs unless we change the system with which we are approaching the AI market and deploying technologies there because it is not designed, if anything, we are trying to fit solutions in. And I think there are opportunities, long duration energy storage. That was kind of my battery prediction for 26 was to not a prediction, but curious to see whether AI actually opens opportunities for battery technologies that have had a lack of beachhead market before. But I'm also not super hopeful that anything's really going to beat out lithium ion right now or anytime soon. The defense market itself is very small and is also very devoid of climate, frankly, in terms of its goals. So, anyway, I think these are the wrong takes unless we're ready to accept defeat. I think if we don't want to enter another clean tech 3.0 that ultimately fails, I think we need to revisit the premise. And that's the point of the talk today. And so, what can we do? I'll be brief here, but my biggest point of this is just to normalize the conversation, right? I posted about this talk on LinkedIn and I got a kind of trolling comment from an individual named Jaden Ranzenberger. I think a lot of people like to be anonymous, and I'm just going to call him out. He gave me a mirror emoji, which I think was meant to be like, oh, you work in venture capital, like, aren't you hypocritical? And I think that's the biggest point I want to drive home to everyone here today. We can all be working within our day jobs in a climate job to do our best within the system. I joined a venture capital firm because I felt like affecting hundreds of millions of dollars was the most impact I could possibly be making. And I think that's true within the system. But do I ultimately think this model is going to solve the climate issue in the time that we need? Increasingly, no, I do not think that, right? And so just because I acknowledge that doesn't mean it's a knock on my firm or a knock on me in my job choice. And that applies to all of you too. We can all say we're doing the best with what we can within the system, and we want to be employed and progress solutions in the ways that are available to us now, but also want to push the system in different directions. And maybe there are ways you can find to bring these sorts of conversations and maybe even change within your job, like I'm doing here today, and like finding a way to give a talk here. I will shout out, I joined the board of the Degrowth Institute, which the executive director, John, joined me here today. Another way I'm kind of contributing my time. If you don't know, the degrowth movement is kind of an intentional downscaling of the overall economy, basically recognizing that the world has outgrown GDP maximization as our kind of North Star, and that we need to intentionally change our priorities and the associated systems and power structures to facilitate broader social justice by promoting equity, planetary health, overall quality of life, et cetera. Um, but maybe it's within your job, maybe it's with outside of your job. At the very least, if we don't acknowledge the limitations of what we're overall doing, we're certainly not going to change anything. So that's my biggest takeaway from today is it's okay to talk about these things, and it's not incongruent with what else, everything else you're doing in your climate job. Policy, right? I mean, I think policy is so much of the crux of it, although I will say I do struggle with all of these government-based approaches that I tend to lean towards in my personal political leanings, just because of the state of the Western world and government today. That really distresses me out with how it can be abused. But if we don't change the system, this will continue to happen. But the irony is we've propped up so many industries, right? Petrochemicals, AI, all these other things, right? What is to say we can't prop up climate in a more intentional way? China is obviously the major example, right? They took a much longer, patient timescale approach, and they are reaping the benefits monetarily. And I don't think their goal was climate, but I think they will be successful in propelling the climate industry in a way the West hasn't. Someone shared with me an interesting example in Canada, the Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy, which contractually requires companies awarded defense procurement contracts to undertake business activity in that country equal to the value of the contracts they've won. So that's just a small example of easy, simple policy mechanisms, not life-changing things that could create more intentional investment and change in market dynamics that could actually prop up an industry in a way that we're not doing now, and going to continue to waste our money when we do invest in these companies that then don't have end markets to sell into. Obviously, the EU has done much more. They have contracts for different carbon border adjustment mechanisms. For the sake of time, I don't want to get too deep into it, but happy to talk about that, or feel free to Google that if you're interested. But again, I joined the Degrowth Institute. I ultimately think we need a much bigger systemic change. We need to vote to elect officials that center climate equity, promote more radical change, universal basic income, free affordable healthcare, education, guaranteed social security, stronger corporate wealth tax policies, right? I think that's where we will get the money to do much of what we need. I think if we continue to let this exact system play out the way it is, we are not going to outgrow this pretty unself-serving, limited mindset with which we've been operating. Now, this is my last slide. This is kind of where I'm more focused as someone that works in venture capital. There was on the last, the keynote, there was mention of patient capital, right? And like new chemistry should find more patient capital. People talk about patient capital a lot. I'm not really aware of very much patient capital that actually exists. Like, you can do the basic math on venture capital and why a 10-year fund lifetime has to have a 3x return, right? It basically is just to beat the stock market. It's to put your money in something that will do better than what you can do with less risk, right? If you extend that to 20 years from 10 years, right, that's got to be now like a 10x return. I would argue that's the China model. They've taken a 20, probably more, but we'll call it, 20-year time frame. And it probably does actually return financially in many cases. And Breakthrough Energy Ventures is an example of this model. They've raised quite a lot of money on this. But ultimately, we'll see where that goes. I mean, I was looking at their portfolio, right? Their inaugural fund was just over 1 billion, closed in 2018. They've invested in 24 companies. I've only could find about 4 companies that have exited at all. From anything I can glean on those companies, I don't think any of those are going to be 10x fund makers. And so I think it's, remains to be proven whether that approach could be successful as well from a returns perspective. What I think is more interesting is some of these nonprofit investing approaches, right, where they raise money from people with no returns expectations, right? You're just giving me the money, it's now mine. But rather than give it out as grants, they do invest it. The problem is that people are greedy, and there's not much that has not been as successful in terms of the amount of funds they can raise, right? I work very closely with Evergreen in Chicago. They're an amazing nonprofit, they write very small checks. When it comes to climate technology development, as I mentioned, these are long, expensive technologies. $250,000 checks, unfortunately, just don't move the needle very much, right? Trellis Climate doesn't have a fund. I think that probably says something. Elemental Impact, I don't know as much about, and I wasn't able to find as much information. They have claimed that they've deployed over $105 million of catalytic capital. I'd be curious to learn a lot more about that. But ultimately, I'd say my career goal, if I could like dream a dream, would be to talk to LPs who invest in climate. I think that tends to be individuals who have some leaning towards the climate issue and care about that, but again, expect returns. And if they understood this presentation, that they are not likely, at least in aggregate, to be successful to get 3x return on that. But that this is still a very important issue as you maybe identified, and that's what brought you to this fund as opposed to a different fund, right? If you weren't going to get that money back either way, might you be inclined to give similar magnitudes of money philanthropically, understanding this is an important time sensitive issue, right? And again, I would be, if I had a dream, I would interview the LPs of the 20-year funds and understand how much they really expect to get back after 20 years, or how much they really do write that off mentally as philanthropic. And if you could change the returns expectation, what you could do to fund companies, allow them to be more successful and to take more risk, which isn't really risk in the way it sounds, but just again, invest in companies that take a lot of money, that don't give back the greatest returns always, but are important companies. Maybe create companies that, sell $10 million of revenue a year, right? Rather than needing to have 20, $50 million to justify a venture capital return, right? Create more companies that actually can exist in this country and actually deploy climate solutions. So this is what I'm starting to think about. If this kind of slide speaks to you, I'd love to talk about it more. I'd also love to talk about any of it more. Thank you so much. I know we started a bit late and I talk a lot, and I can stay as long as you want, but I know we are basically out of time. So I really do apologize about that. But thank you so much again for coming. I really, really appreciate it.